She thought her badge made her untouchable, until she brought the wrong man to court. The tires crunched slowly over the gravel as Elijah Boone guided his truck to the shoulder, the Mississippi night folding in around him like a heavy, suffocating quilt. Even the cicadas had fallen silent. Somewhere beyond the cotton fields, a freight train moaned low against the stars, a sound too lonely to be mistaken for anything but a warning. The flashing red and blue lights behind him weren't just lights. They were a signal, a line drawn in the dirt. He kept his hands high, his breathing steady, the rituals of survival older than memory itself. Elijah had spent his life teaching others how to build bridges instead of walls, how to fight with persistence instead of anger. But none of that mattered now. To the deputy stepping out of her cruiser, he was just another figure cast under suspicion's long shadow. Then the world shattered. They slammed him against the hood so hard, the engine groaned like a dying animal. The impact jolted through the steel and into the bones of the night itself. The lights strobed viciously across the fields, each pulse carving the dark into cruel, broken pieces. But Elijah Boone did not flinch. Not when the cuffs bit into his skin, not when the silence of the delta pressed against his chest. Tonight, they thought they could erase him. But tonight, Elijah Boone would become the crack that split the dam wide open, and the land would not forget. The Mississippi Delta did not forgive easily. It remembered every injustice the way an old cottonwood remembers every lightning strike, gnarled, blackened, but somehow still standing. The land stretched out flat and unbroken, as if daring the sky itself to find a flaw. There were places here where the air smelled of mud and magnolia, where the songs of sharecroppers still seemed to hum beneath the cracked soil, and where history was not something you read about, but something you wore, heavy as the humidity clinging to your skin. Elijah Boone knew this land the way a man knows an old scar, by touch, by memory, by pain. At 53, he carried the delta inside him, each footstep a quiet testimony to survival in a place that too often mistook silence for peace. The world told itself stories about Mississippi, tales of change, progress, moving on. But Elijah knew better. Here, ghosts didn't haunt houses. They haunted the living. On the night everything shifted, the air was so thick you could almost drink it. The road back to Greenwood twisted through fields left fallow under a sickle moon. Elijah's truck, a battered Chevy with a cracked windshield and a heart that refused to quit, rumbled steadily over potholes big enough to swallow dreams. The headlights caught glimpses of sagging porches, rusted mailboxes, and the occasional figure sitting in the dark, smoking, watching, remembering. Then the red and blue lights cut through the night like a blade through soft flesh. It wasn't a surprise. Men like Elijah Boone didn't live long in the Delta by being surprised. He pulled over, his motions deliberate, respectful, the way he had taught a generation of boys who thought bravery was all noise and fists, hands on the wheel, eyes forward, breath deep but slow. In Mississippi, surviving a traffic stop wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about understanding which way the wind was blowing and when to stand still. Deputy Lila McKenna approached like a thunderstorm on two legs. Her boots hit the pavement hard, her flashlight a blinding weapon, her hand close enough to her holster to write its history. She didn't see a man who had built literacy programs for low-income families. She didn't know a veteran who had once pulled comrades out of burning tanks. She saw something else, something she had been taught to fear. "License and registration," she demanded. Elijah moved slowly, each gesture deliberate, like a man speaking a language older than words. The road hummed underfoot. The cicadas shrieked. Somewhere beyond the fields, A freight train mourned its way toward Memphis. "You were weaving," she said, voice sharp enough to cut. "I wasn't," Elijah answered, not defiant, not pleading, simply stating a fact in a world that didn't care much for facts, when a badge gleamed brighter than truth. "Step out of the vehicle." And he did. The streetlight flickered overhead, casting the scene in fits and starts, like some cruel, silent film. Elijah's shadow stretched long across the road, taller than any man had a right to be. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He endured the way his father had, and his grandfather before him. But this night was different, because tucked in the breast pocket of Elijah's shirt, recording every word, every gesture, was a small camera, silent, watchful, patient. And because standing there, with his dignity intact and the earth solid beneath his boots, Elijah Boone decided that this time history would not be written by those who shouted the loudest or struck the hardest. This time, it would be written by the one who refused to disappear. The delta winds shifted, carrying with them the first hints of rain, of reckoning, of stories no longer whispered, but spoken aloud for all to hear. And Elijah Boone, son of the South, son of survivors, stood quietly at the edge of change, knowing that even in a place where the ground itself tried to swallow you whole, a man could still stand tall and make the sky listen. Elijah Boone was not made in a single moment. He was carved by decades, by sweat pooled under cotton-picking suns, by prayers whispered through barred church doors, by silent stares exchanged at town hall meetings where his voice was heard but not heeded. He wore resilience the way other men wore pride, quiet and heavy across his shoulders. At 53, Elijah had outlived the worst predictions. They said men like him would be broken by 25, buried by 40. But Elijah knew the secret they never taught in school. Survival was not a matter of strength. It was a matter of faith. Faith in the slow, stubborn work of building something that might outlast the hate trying to tear it down. He had seen war firsthand, not the kind captured in glossy photographs, but the kind that clung to your lungs like dust. In the Persian Gulf, he learned how to patch up bleeding men under blackened skies, and how to bury brothers without promises that their sacrifice would be remembered. But it wasn't the desert that hardened him. It was the return home. It was the way old neighbors still locked their doors when he walked past, the way opportunity narrowed like a noose. Instead of succumbing to bitterness, Elijah built bridges one brick at a time. He became the man who fixed broken screen doors for widows too proud to ask. The man who spent weekends tutoring second-chance students at the Baptist church's back hall, where the ceiling leaked and the heat never quite reached the corners. He collected the forgotten, the overlooked, the left behind, and gave them something no law, no politician, no program had managed to offer: dignity. There was no news story when he paid the property taxes for Miss Lorraine after her husband died. No headlines when he drove Mr. Charlie to the VA hospital 2 counties over because the buses stopped running that fall. Elijah did not perform kindness as a spectacle. He lived it, breath by breath, choice by choice. People respected him the way you respect a levee in flood season. You may not notice it every day, but you know when it's gone, you drown. Yet the badge on Deputy McKenna's chest weighed heavier in the moment she stopped him than all the years he had stacked against her assumptions. She didn't see the man who had stitched broken neighborhoods together, with hands too rough to be delicate, but too tender to leave wounds alone. She didn't see the nights he sat up late, writing grant proposals to buy second-hand computers for kids whose futures were already being mortgaged away. She saw only the outline of a threat. And Elijah, standing on the side of that dusty road, understood something profound and old. It didn't matter how many fields you plowed, how many children you taught, how many wars you survived. Sometimes, survival demanded more than breathing. Sometimes it demanded that you stand, steady and unyielding, and say without words, "I was here. I am not invisible. I am not expendable." That night, when Deputy McKenna looked into Elijah's face and saw only defiance where there was dignity, only danger where there was decency, she made a mistake as old as the soil beneath their feet. And Elijah Boone, son of survivors, man of steady hands and stubborn heart, knew this would not be a night swallowed by silence. It would be a night that cracked something open, something that had waited too long to be seen, too long to be heard, too long to be honored not with pity, but with justice. When Deputy McKenna stepped out of her cruiser, the night shifted. It was not just the screech of the gravel under her boots, or the mechanical click of her holster strap snapping free. It was the way the stars themselves seemed to dim, the way the road exhaled as if bracing for impact. Elijah Boone watched her approach with the patience of a man who had seen hurricanes gather out of cloudless skies. He understood posturing when he saw it, the rigid spine, the narrowed eyes, the thumb grazing the butt of the sidearm, not from threat, but from habit born of assumption. In that moment, Deputy McKenna wasn't an officer maintaining order. She was a storm looking for somewhere to land. "License and registration," she said again, sharper this time, as if volume could rewrite reality. Elijah answered with silence, not defiance, not mockery. Silence born of calculation, of weighing outcomes the way a carpenter measures a beam, precisely, deliberately, with no margin for error. He moved slowly, narrating each step as he retrieved his documents, each word stitched with the weariness of generations taught that survival was a choreography you never stopped practicing. "Have you been drinking tonight?" McKenna asked, tilting her head just enough to feign curiosity. "No, ma'am," Elijah replied, voice as steady as the riverbanks during flood season. "Please step out for a moment for a test." Elijah's pulse didn't quicken. His breathing didn't change. He stepped out, boots meeting the cracked asphalt with a soft finality. He already knew the field sobriety test wasn't about impairment. It was about humiliation. It was about making a point, that no amount of decency, no amount of contribution, no amount of quiet dignity could shield him when suspicion wrapped itself around his skin. He followed her commands, walked the invisible line under the half-dead streetlight, touched nose to fingertip, counted backward from 99 without missing a beat. And still, she frowned. Still, she scribbled. "Failure to maintain lane," she muttered, tearing the ticket from her pad with more force than necessary, the paper trembling like it wanted to escape her hand. As she handed it over, her gaze met his, not in triumph, but in something murkier. A flicker of doubt, perhaps, or shame, but it was gone before it could take root. Elijah folded the ticket with the same deliberate care he used to fold the flag over a fallen brother's casket years ago. The gesture was not lost on the night. It settled between them, a silent rebuke more potent than any shouted word. He climbed back into his truck. The engine grumbled awake. He signaled. He checked his mirrors. He merged back onto the empty highway as if he had all the time in the world, though he knew that time had always been a borrowed thing for men like him. Behind him, Deputy McKenna sat in her cruiser, engine idling, ticket book on the passenger seat, badge heavy against her chest. For a long moment, neither moved. Because deep down, past the starched uniform and academy-issued certainties, something in her understood. She hadn't stopped a drunk. She hadn't corrected a threat. She had pressed her authority onto a man who had done nothing but survive too long, stand too tall, and refuse, quietly, stubbornly, devastatingly, to vanish. The road unwound before Elijah, dark and waiting. He did not roar down it. He moved steadily, sure, a man who knew that storms did not announce themselves with noise. They announced themselves with pressure, with cracks, with slow, relentless shifts. And somewhere deep inside him, Elijah Boone understood that the honest reckoning had only just begun. Elijah Boone didn't rage. He didn't shout or pound the steering wheel as the Delta night swallowed the last glow of McKenna's cruiser behind him. Rage was a luxury men like him could not afford. Rage burned fast. But real change, change that lasts, required a steadier flame. At the kitchen table, beneath the low hum of a tired ceiling fan, Elijah laid the citation flat beside his phone, his hands moving with the same precision he used to fold shirts in the Navy. The small device had captured it all: the stop, the tone, the trembling paper, the silent, stubborn dignity. He replayed the footage once, then again, not looking for mistakes. There were none, but studying it the way a man studies weather before a long journey, searching for signs. He opened his battered laptop, the keys stuck from years of spilled coffee and the stubborn dust of Mississippi summers. Carefully, methodically, he filed a formal complaint with the sheriff's office. He copied it to the county oversight committee. He blind copied an attorney he trusted from his day's fundraising for the literacy drive. He didn't embellish, didn't dramatize, only told the truth, steady, quiet, and unyielding. Across town, in a courthouse built when separate was still the law of the land, the wheels began to turn, slow, reluctant, but inevitable. Was it naive to believe that truth alone could crack the armor of habit and prejudice? Was it foolish to think that one man's calm testimony could outlast a system that had swallowed better men whole? Elijah didn't ask these questions aloud. He answered them the only way he knew how: by moving forward. The town buzzed by the weekend. Whispers curled out of barber shops and church pews, drifting down grocery aisles and across dusty parking lots. They said Mr. Boone had filed papers. They said it wasn't the first time someone tried, but maybe, just maybe, it would be the first time someone finished what they started. He didn't show anger when he signed the notarized affidavit. He didn't flinch when an off-duty deputy muttered under his breath at the gas station. Elijah Boone moved through his days the way rivers move through canyons, slow, sure, reshaping everything in their path without apology. At the literacy center that Saturday, a young boy tugged at his sleeve during reading hour, his voice too soft for the others to hear. "Mr. Boone," he whispered, "are you scared?" Elijah knelt, so their faces were level, the boy's wide brown eyes reflecting something too old for his age. He smiled, a slow, sad smile that carried more weight than any lecture. "I'm not scared," he said quietly. "I'm steady. There's a difference." Isn't that what every man hopes for when the world leans heavily on his shoulders? To stay steady when fear would be easier? The boy nodded solemnly, clutching his borrowed book tightly. And somewhere deep in the marrow of the town, a shift began. Not loud, not sudden, but real. Because sometimes the first crack in the wall isn't made by a battering ram. Sometimes it's made by the simple, unstoppable truth of a man who refuses to bow. The courthouse smelled of sweat and old wood, the air thick with the kind of heat that even the ceiling fans couldn't push away. Elijah Boone stood at the plaintiff's table, a single sheet of worn legal pad paper folded neatly before him. He wore the same navy blazer he had worn to his daughter's graduation, his shoulders squared, his face calm, not because he felt invincible, but because he had learned long ago that real strength had nothing to do with feeling safe. Across the aisle, Deputy McKenna shifted in her seat, the badge on her uniform gleaming under the tired fluorescent lights. Her attorney whispered in her ear, but her jaw stayed tight, her eyes trained somewhere above Elijah's head, as if looking him in the face might undo her. The room was filled with the steady, unblinking gaze of the town itself. Farmers with sun-cracked hands, teachers with notebooks balanced on their knees, grandmothers with hats wide enough to shadow entire pews. They had come not for spectacle, but for reckoning. The court clerk called the case number. The judge, an older man with eyebrows like scrub brush and a voice roughened by decades of gavel banging, nodded to Elijah's attorney. The footage played first. It was not dramatic. No shouting, no violence, just the slow, undeniable erosion of dignity under the weight of assumption. Elijah's calm voice, McKenna's sharp demands. The stillness in Elijah's body said, "How many times must I prove I belong on this road, in this town, in this life?" The courtroom didn't shift or murmur. They watched. They listened. And in the heavy, humming silence, something ancient stirred, the memory of other trials, other wrongs left to rot beneath polite smiles. McKenna's defense was thin, a sheet of paper trying to cover a flood. She said she feared for her safety. She told Elijah didn't answer quickly enough. She said it was standard procedure. But no procedure could explain the tension in her voice when Elijah complied without hesitation. No manual could excuse the way she scrawled that citation as if punishing an idea, not a man. When Elijah took the stand, he didn't try to summon righteous anger. He spoke plainly, his voice the same steady rumble that had taught hundreds of children how to find their place in books and the world. "I stood where she told me to stand," he said. "I followed every command. I didn't resist. I didn't threaten. I didn't run. I didn't need to. I have lived a life that answers every question her badge could ask. How many more times must a man stand unarmed, unthreatening, unyielding, and still be seen as the enemy?" The jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, the foreman's voice trembled slightly as he read the verdict. In favor of Elijah Boone, violation of constitutional rights. Award of $42,500 in damages. Record to be made public. There was no applause, no outburst. Only the sound of Elijah's slow, even breath, and the creak of wooden benches as neighbors shifted, some bowing their heads, some lifting their chins higher. McKenna didn't meet his eyes as she left the courtroom. The badge on her chest seemed heavier now, weighed down not by the metal, but by the truth. Outside, the sun burned hot against the concrete steps. Elijah paused at the top, letting the light wash over him. A reporter called out, microphone raised. "Mr. Boone, do you have any comments?" Elijah Boone, a man who had survived wars seen and unseen, a man who had planted seeds in barren soil, smiled the smallest, most unstoppable smile. "I still believe," he said. "Isn't belief itself an act of rebellion when the world dares you to give it up?" He tipped his hat, turned, and walked into the heat, each step carving a new path into a land that had long tried to forget men like him. But not today. Today, the ground remembers. The victory in the courthouse was not the kind of victory that made front pages or fueled shouting matches on television panels. It was quieter, heavier. A weight had been lifted off a back that had grown accustomed to bearing it. Elijah Boone did not celebrate with raised fists or loud declarations. He nodded once to the horizon as if acknowledging a debt long overdue. In the days that followed, life in Greenwood moved forward with the slow stubbornness of the Delta itself. The same pickup trucks rumbled down Main Street. The same river winds coiled through the cypress trees. But something, imperceptible to the casual observer, had shifted. It showed in the way Miss Clara smiled a little wider at the bakery when Elijah walked in for his morning coffee. It lingered in the way Deacon Turner shook his hand a little longer after Sunday service. It vibrated in the air at the literacy center when Elijah opened the battered front door, letting in a line of boys and girls with second-hand backpacks and brand-new hopes. He never mentioned the trial to them. He never needed to. They had felt it, the way you think thunder before the rain. Instead, he picked up a book, called them to a circle, and began to read. Each word rolled slowly and carefully off his tongue, a bridge from the heavy past to the trembling, beautiful possibility of what might come next. He taught them not just the letters and the sounds, but the idea that they, too, had a place in the great unfinished story of their country. Not because someone granted it to them, but because they claimed it, because they had the right, because they were born with it, written into their bones. At night, Elijah would sit on his porch, listening to the crickets tuning their songs under the vast Mississippi sky. Sometimes neighbors would stop by, sit a spell, talk about crops or weather, or nothing at all. And sometimes they would speak of the trial, low and careful, as if naming it too loudly might wake old dangers that were better left sleeping. Elijah never pushed the conversation. He understood the power of silence, the way it could convey a message more profound than words ever could. Change, he knew, did not arrive with parades and speeches. It came like the first green shoot after a flood, fragile but inevitable. And so he waited. Not in bitterness, not in exhaustion, but in the quiet certainty that every small stand mattered. That every time a man refused to be diminished, the world bent just slightly closer to justice. The courthouse file would gather dust. The headlines, where they existed at all, would yellow and curl at the edges. But Elijah Boone's stand would not vanish. It would live on in the boy who dared to speak up when his voice trembled, in the girl who raised her hand in a classroom where no one expected her to, in the older woman who walked into a polling booth after a lifetime of being told she shouldn't bother. It would live wherever dignity took root against the odds, wherever hope held on with both hands. Elijah Boone never set out to change the world, but by standing steady when it mattered most, he had done precisely that. At the edge of every small town, some stories refuse to die. They linger in the way an elder nods as a child speaks with newfound courage, in the way a teenager signs his name boldly on a scholarship form, in the way a young woman holds her head a fraction higher when she walks into a room that once dared her to shrink. In Greenwood, Mississippi, Elijah Boone became one of those stories, not through headlines or monuments or ceremonies, but through seeds planted in the quiet corners of ordinary days, watered by resilience, tended by hope. At the literacy center, the children spoke of him with a mixture of reverence and familiarity. "Mr. Boone says we stand tall, even when it's easier to sit," they whispered among themselves, passing the words along like secret passwords to a future they could barely imagine, but now dared to believe in. When a 10-year-old boy named Jeremiah, with scraped elbows and a voice too soft for the playground, stood up at a school board meeting to demand a new library roof, people took notice. When young Micah, whose mother once worked 2 shifts and still couldn't afford college textbooks, became the first in his family to earn a degree, he dedicated his thesis to The man who taught me reading was a form of standing. When teenage girls who had been taught to speak only when spoken to began starting book clubs, debate teams, and volunteer drives, their laughter rang through Greenwood's cracked sidewalks like church bells announcing a new day. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. It was steady, like the slow changing of the river's course after a long, stubborn flood. And always, quietly, Elijah Boone's example moved among them. He never lectured. He never demanded. He simply lived the truth that dignity, once claimed, could not be confiscated by fear or badge or law written by another man's hand. His influence didn't end at Greenwood's town limits. It traveled outward with every child who dared to dream beyond cotton fields and broken promises. It rode on buses heading north toward colleges with unfamiliar names. It marched in protest lines and stood behind voting booths, filling out first-time business loan applications with trembling but determined hands. Elijah Boone had not set out to be a symbol. But symbols are not always chosen. Sometimes they are earned. And though Elijah returned each evening to his porch with its sagging swing and chipped railings, he carried more than memories. He carried the future, stitched into every soft-spoken boy who raised his voice, every hesitant girl who stood her ground, every grown man or woman who remembered that even a quiet stand can split mountains. Because change does not always roar. Sometimes it hums, sometimes it whispers, and sometimes, because a man once refused to shrink beneath a deputy's gaze, it sings. Some stories do not end with a bang. They end with a breath, a slow unwinding of something tight that had been wound for too long. Elijah Boone's story was not about the size of the crowd that gathered, or the number of articles that were written. It was about the quiet spaces he left stronger than he found them. In the end, the measure of his stand was not carved in plaques or stitched into flags. It was carried in the way a town sat a little straighter, spoke a little louder, loved a little deeper. Because Elijah understood something many men spend lifetimes chasing. Justice is not a destination. It is a practice. It is choosing to stand steady when it is easier to sit down. It is choosing to speak the truth when silence is the safer option. It is choosing to be visible when the world would rather you disappear. His story reminded them, reminded all of us, that dignity cannot be granted. It must be claimed. It must be protected. And sometimes it must be fought for in ways so quiet, so patient, that the fight looks like endurance instead of rebellion. Elijah Boone did not set out to change the world. He set out to hold his piece of it steady so that others might find firmer ground to stand on. And because he did, because he refused to vanish, a door stayed open that might have closed forever. A door that now, generation after generation, they would walk through, heads high, eyes forward, voices unafraid. That is the legacy of a man who stands his ground when it matters most. Not thunder, not lightning, but the kind of steady rain that carves canyons, that feeds fields, that changes the shape of a land without ever asking permission. And somewhere, under the broad Mississippi sky, the land itself remembers. In a world that often rewards noise over meaning, Elijah Boone's story reminds us of a quieter, stronger kind of victory, the kind built on patience, truth, and the simple act of refusing to disappear. His courage is not loud. It does not demand attention. It simply stands, steady and sure, until the world has no choice but to notice. What would you have done in Elijah's place? Would you have held your ground with the same quiet conviction? I would love to hear your reflections. How does his story speak to you? If this journey has touched something profound within you, if it has stirred memories or dreams, remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Every comment you leave is a flame that keeps these powerful stories burning bright. Thank you for being part of this space today. Your voice matters. Your presence matters. Together, we keep hope alive.